Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed the breakout sessions you attended today. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kevin Kruger, President and CEO of NSHE, Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education since 2012. You all will have an opportunity to ask Dr. Kruger questions at the end of the session, so please input those in the chat. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Kruger.
Thank you, Barbara. It's good to be here. And thanks for the invitation. I'm excited about the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today about what I've seen happening in higher education and where we're heading, particularly with the student affairs lens. I have to acknowledge that I was asked to do this by Shannon Ellis, who is really one of my dearest friends and colleagues for so long. I mean, I've known Shannon, I think, since the very beginning of my time at NSHE. And Shannon, thanks for the invitation. I have fond memories of the last time I was on your campus doing something similar, actually. And it's nice to still have the opportunity to be with all of you. So as Barbara mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of NSHE, which is the largest student affairs association in the world. We serve about 2,000 college universities and about 16,000 student affairs professionals here in the United States and also globally. I've been at NSHE coming actually this July will be my starting my 27th year at NSHE. So I've been here a long time and enjoy the opportunity to do these kinds of things because I get a chance to interact with a wide range of student affairs folks, and I also get to share with you the thinking I have about where things are going. I do a lot of this really from a work habit that I think Shannon's heard me talk about. I'm an early riser. I get up, usually get up at 5 o'clock or so, and I'm at my desk pretty early. And I use the early part of my day to read because there's so much interesting things happening every single day in in the news about higher ed, research, reports, that kind of thing. And so a lot of my perspectives are gained from that kind of broad view. I also share that I have some more direct knowledge other than my 16 years working on a college campus. My daughter right now is a sophomore at the University of Maryland, and my son just graduated from the University of Maryland, so he's entered the job market, he's working. But between the two of them, I have sort of this, very small micro example of what college life is like from their viewpoint. And it's been interesting to kind of frame that against my own, reading experiences. So I'm going to go off camera in a moment because I'm going to share my screen, and the way this Vimeo works, you'll only see this slides. I'll be here. And then we'll come back together at the end for questions or comments or thoughts. So as you're listening to what I have to say, you might take some notes or just think a little bit about how we want to engage in the last part of the session. So, all right, so give me a second. Let me share my screen. Hang on, where is it? Okay, 1 second. Okay. Right again. We did test this out, and it worked. There it is. Okay, so you should now see my screen and my slides, and none of me at this point. So let's dive in. I'm gonna throughout this speech, I'm gonna share 3 quotes from one of my favorites, Tom Hanks, and some things that he has had to say in some movies that he's been a part of. I don't know how your pandemic has been, but for me, I read more, I traveled less, I ate in restaurants a lot less, but I also watched a lot more TV, and I watched a lot more movies and the like. So a couple of Tom Hanks movies have been on circulation, and one of them was Apollo 13, which last year was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. And if you remember that story, well, it's 50 years ago, it was Apollo 13 astronauts were supposed to land on the moon. they had the lunar module attached to the spacecraft, and they were going through some rocket firing exercises to keep them in orbit. And when they fired a rocket, there was an explosion, and part of the spaceship was damaged. And immediately, this set off a series of things, which is one of the more famous lines that you've heard from this experience, when they said, "Houston, we have a problem." Where I'm going to go with this is this 50-year-old example in 2020 of the Apollo 13 spacecraft problem reminds me of the 2020 pandemic problem and pandemic problems. And that is, world, we have a problem. And in the case of the George Floyd pandemic related to racial justice, America, we have a problem. Now, you might remember in the movie, they had this kind of famous scene where what they realized is that the carbon dioxide was building up in the spacecraft. And what they realized is that the reason for that was that they were spending more time in that spacecraft than originally intended, 3 people. And so they were exceeding the capacity of these carbon dioxide scrubbers they had in the main spacecraft. What they realized is they could get, since they weren't going to use the lunar module to land on the moon, they could grab the scrubbers from there and use those and implant them, and they would extend the living oxygen they had in the spacecraft until they landed. So when they went to pull the scrubbers from the lunar module, they realized that those were square, that the apertures were square, and the holes in the spacecraft were round. So which became one of these sort of famous scenes where they're duct taping these things together, and because when they discovered these 2 things weren't going to fit, the head of mission control said, "I suggest you figure out a way to put a square peg in a round hole." And that's also my metaphor for what we've been through in the pandemic, particularly in higher education and related to the COVID-19 crisis. A lot of what we had been doing wasn't going to work anymore, and sometimes did feel like it was a square peg in a round hole. And then we did a lot of jury rigging and kind of figuring it out, and we're able to actually make that work in the same way that worked. And so leading up to that, so in that context, I want to also think about another Tom Hanks movie, A League of Their Own. Some of you may not have seen that; it's a little older. In that movie, Tom Hanks plays the character Jimmy Dugan, who's coaching a women's baseball team and helping them compete and increase their level of play. And it's somewhere in the middle of that process, the women baseball players were complaining to Coach Dugan about how hard it was. And so he says famously, "It's supposed to be hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would do it. The hard is what makes it great." And for me, that's how I think about student affairs in the pandemic. It was hard, and not everyone can do it. In fact, what we kind of learned from that is that most campuses relied on their student affairs divisions for a lot of the ways in which the campus maneuvered through the COVID crisis, whether that be contact tracing or crisis management or communication, or how we keep people safe on the campus. And the hard is what makes it great. And that's how I feel also coming out of the pandemic related to student affairs. The hard is what makes it great. We and you excelled in that effort and allowed campuses to continue to function educationally. It wasn't just us, obviously. It was a partnership between us and academic affairs and the faculty, but we played a significant role in that. And I think we all should feel good about what we did, because in a lot of ways, again, we were taking a square peg, and square peg is sort of this idea that a lot of what we did is in person, right? A lot of the notions of engagement and contact were in person, and we shifted that to be entirely online. So one of the interesting things, of course, will be coming out of that is how we, what is it that we change going forward, and what do we keep from the pandemic that we found to be really valuable. So in that light, I'm going to talk about 5 issues that will help us frame out that conversation. It's a little bit of a sense of how things are going budgetarily for higher education, what we know, what we don't know. It's clear, and if you've read anything in Inside Higher Education or the Chronicle of Higher Education, or even New York Times, Washington Post, you've seen a lot of stories about mental health, and I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are from a mental health standpoint with our students, and what's changed, what's amplified, those kinds of things. There are some clear equity challenges that we have coming out of the pandemic. I want to shed some light on that. And then also shed some light on the notion of civic engagement / protest and activism, that we didn't see as much of, at least on campus, but I think we will see much more of coming out of the pandemic this fall when our campuses reopen fully. And then lastly, a little bit about career and workforce development, and then we'll take some time for questions. So let's dive into this. So as I indicated before, how I come to these notions is really sort of reading the tea leaves. I do spend a lot of time reading what people are saying about higher education, thought leaders, research reports, whatever's out there. And I'm trying to say, like, what does this all suggest for the future a little bit? And that's really what I want to share with you. So one way to do that is look at what's in the news. What are people talking about in the news that relates to higher education? Particularly, I want to start with this notion around budget. Like, what are we seeing around the budget issues that higher education is facing? So I'm going to pick out a couple of things here. So when SUNY, which is the State University of New York, their system budget came out not too long ago. Governor Cuomo proposed a budget which included a $46 million reduction in general operating support to SUNY. That sounds a little challenging, right? So those dollars will have to get spread across all the institutions. $26 million for CUNY, which is the City University of New York. And in New York's case, they eliminated a program that had been funding some private schools, not entirely, and not the same amount that state schools were funded, but they've been funding some private education, and they've eliminated that program. We see a series of other things that are occurring in different places. As a result of that, CUNY laid off 3,000 adjunct faculty. There's been a lot of adjunct faculty who have been laid off, and faculty in some cases as well, and as we've eliminated programs in some campuses. Here we see the University of Illinois approved a budget that was $239 million, 32 less than last year in 2021. We see furloughs at UMass, University of Wyoming, $42 million reduction, which was related to a 10% cut of state funding. We'll get to Nevada in a moment. Ohio Wesleyan eliminating 18 majors. A lot of campuses, particularly at the privates and some of the regional publics that you may see in Nevada, are kind of coming to terms with the reality that the number of academic programs that have been offered may not be sustainable. And so looking at low performing majors and limiting some majors there is certainly one strategy that some campuses have used. And you see University of Akron suspending tenure rules and laying off 97 unionized faculty. That's a pretty big deal if you think about where we have been related to the professoriate and the increases in adjunct faculty or contingency faculty and sort of the threats that many faculty feel around the tenured process. And so these are an example of some of the things that we've seen. Now, in a more positive way, this is some data about how states have used their CARES funding. Because as you probably are aware, the initial round of stimulus that came out under the Trump administration, and the CARES funding had money that went to the states that could be used for education. And this does not include the Biden administration most recent stimulus package, which also has some additional funds for states. So these percentages will change. But I'm going to use an example of sort of I don't know, you probably don't consider it a neighbor, but as an East Coast person, I'm going to say Colorado is kind of in your area a little bit. So Colorado went from, if you look there, from a 45% cut in fiscal support of education to after the CARES funding was applied, it went down to only 3.8. If you look at Louisiana as another example, they 8.3% drop in originally state support higher education from the previous year, and then ends up being a 1.2% increase. So there's both these states applying some of their CARES funding to higher education to reduce the fiscal impact on higher ed. Nevada is not using, apparently, its funding, at least from the analysis that was done by this group. It's maintaining a 17.8% decrease. Now, maybe in the questioning, we might get some additional information about that, but every state is not required to do that. And you'll see if you look at not every state is applying funds in the same kind of way. So there's a disparate effect in terms of how states will react to all this. One of the most recent lessons we have is how did all this work for the recession of 2008, 2009? In that recession, we did see fairly substantial across-the-board cuts in higher education support by states that really never returned, actually, even to the pre-pandemic levels. The dollar amount, but may have come up, but the inflation-adjusted dollars did not recover a lot of the resources that we lost in the 2008-2009 recession. And that's been difficult for not just student affairs, but for all of higher education. I suspect we're going to see something similar coming out of this recession. One other point is that we also know that one of the ways that higher education institutions managed to get through the COVID crisis was through job losses. And I mentioned you saw a couple there in faculty, staff, of course, and some of those staff, were lower paid employees who were in the service part of the institution, perhaps maintenance workers or groundskeepers or dining service employees. Like the rest of America, often it was our lowest paid employees who had the most significant impact on their jobs. But we see here overall 650,000 job losses total through the pandemic in higher education. If you put that against other sectors in our country, it's about the third highest. So obviously restaurants and the travel industry would be the highest. But we're actually in the very top of the sectors of our country that lost jobs. I think one of the challenges we have going forward is, from a productivity standpoint, is can we bring back some of those folks? And if not, what does that mean in terms of the workload and ability for us to do the work? So now I'm speaking a lot to our younger professionals in the audience, who probably are already feeling like the expectations of the job have increased in the pandemic and are worried about what that's going to be like out of the pandemic. So I guess the question is, do we have a budget crisis in higher education? I think we do, but I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet. I think we need to be prepared for a tough couple of years, and I'll show you why. Okay, one is we're still recovering from the costs of COVID. Here's an example of one institution in the Southeast, a private institution, who cataloged their losses and costs during the pandemic. And on the left side, you have all the PPE that was required to maintain the campus in this current form. If you have a residential component of your campus, I know we also have a lot of community colleges here, but if you have a residential component, you know that you never closed, that our residence halls always had people in it. International students who were housing insecure, students didn't have safe places to go. So we never really closed down completely, even though sometimes people will say, oh, the college closed. No, the college went to online classes, but a lot of the in-person stuff still remained. But in any format, we had to spend a lot of money on testing, contact tracing, screening, and of course, PPE equipment. That in this particular case was $30 million. And then a lot of the revenue or the costs were sort of lost costs related to revenue that never happened, related to athletics and dining and housing and other auxiliaries. In this case, that was, for this campus, it was $67.9 million. So those funds have to come from somewhere. So that's one institutional hit that we've had. The other is enrollment. And again, I don't know where Nevada is in your institutions across the country. I haven't seen the Nevada data. I'd be interested in you sharing that at the break. But what we do know is that many institutions prior to the pandemic had an expectation that their enrollment would include increasing numbers of Latinx students who are coming to higher education in general. We have fewer white non-Hispanic families who had children, so thus we knew we were seeing drop-offs in white non-Hispanic youth, college-age youth. But there was sort of it didn't totally replace it, but we knew there was an increase in Latinx enrollment or high school graduations. What we saw, though, is that for financial reasons, because of the intersection between race, ethnicity, and income in our country, we saw larger drop-offs of what this clearinghouse calls Hispanic, or what we call Latinx sometimes, but a 20% drop for the fall of 20. We also saw drops in Black students, and then less so, although still measurable, for whites and Asians. And Native American or indigenous students had the highest drop-off. The data we've seen so far for fall 21 tends to be related to size. What we've seen in essence is the land grants, the larger institutions like UNLV are actually doing quite well, seeing more applications. And the regional publics, the smaller privates, and of course the community colleges are seeing enrollment declines. This is in the four-year sector, and we see this very small campuses down 29%, and you can see it's almost linear, that as you get to some of these bigger campuses, you're seeing less of an impact on, at least at this point, on the early decision, early action, which is the data we have. The Common App shows a similar story. Our applications to the largest campuses increased and decreased at the smallest campuses. The most selective institutions saw larger increases. So in fact, if you look at the Ivies and the elites, they're all doing smashingly well. It's the institutions that are smaller and more regional that are having a more difficult time. In general, though, what's been difficult, and a lot of this is sort of unknown, application rates are up across the country. So students are applying to more campuses. Maybe they're kind of weighing bets about either financial aid or scholarships or whether they can afford to go one place versus the other. But we certainly see a lot more students applying, which is throwing off all the yield models that we have for admissions. And then, what we have known before the pandemic, the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and the Northeast are being hit the hardest in terms of enrollment challenges and enrollment declines, where the Southwest, Nevada, some parts of California are doing actually a little bit better. Some of that's driven by demographics. This is a little hard to read, but this is college presidents in a most recent survey talking about what they see happening. And I thought it was kind of interesting related to this budget question. One question: fewer prospective students and parents are interested in paying the same price for virtual learning as for in-person learning. So one of the things we have learned is that while we were able to pivot to online learning, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the quality of it and also dissatisfaction with the fact that we're charging the same amount for it. So here we have presidents, almost 83% saying they think students are not going to want to pay the same amount if we stay online. So there's a lot of pressure to go back to in-person classes. COVID-19 will cause a shift in enrollment trends for years to come, with more prospective students favoring virtual instruction than before the pandemic. Now, virtual instruction doesn't mean not being in person on class and not in person at all. It just means that students, we're just going to see more virtual instruction in general. That was a trend that was already happening before the pandemic, and then we way accelerated it through the pandemic and probably caught up 10 years in terms of that trend. And then lastly, COVID will cause a shift from more expensive colleges to more affordable ones, such as community colleges. It's interesting that we have almost 2 in 10 presidents saying that. The data doesn't quite suggest that yet. So we may be a little bit sort of a lagging indicator for community colleges. As you know, if you're in the community college sector, that most community colleges are suffering enrollment declines. And largely that's an affordability question also, due to the fact that many community colleges in America are appealing options for lower income first generation students, often students of color, and that has been disrupted by the COVID crisis as more families lost their jobs or were furloughed. The affordability, I think, has made that a challenge for many low income families. So we can take some questions about the financial stuff later, but that's sort of sketched out. So the conclusion there is, we don't know yet what the impact's going to be. It certainly seems like the enrollment is going to be have an impact on many campuses. State funding is going to have an impact. Recovering from the residual of the pandemic has an impact, and all of that will filter down to student affairs for sure, as we have to manage our budgets. I think my best guess as I'm talking to people is that the tail on this is a little longer than we want it to be. That we'll be back in full functioning as a society with maybe even without masks and social distancing well before the budgetary impact on campuses ends. And that's typical for higher education, that we tend to see a longer tail for some of those financial implications. So let's talk about mental health. Here's the same survey of college presidents, and one could maybe not come as a surprise to you, and it's kind of heartening that, in fact, college presidents understand that mental health is a big issue for their students. So 96% saying that's one of their top issues. And then we sort of see the second issue is disproportionate impact on students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then third, mental health of employees. So mental health in aggregate, pretty big deal for both, as for a president's standpoint, for students and their employees. So as we look back a little bit, this was a word cloud that was created right around the beginning of the pandemic when we sent students home. And again, borrowing from my personal experience, my daughter, when she left the residence halls and had to scurry and pack everything up, came home, sad, disappointed, stressed, upset, frustrated, annoyed. All these I think were in play for our students. It was a very challenging time to shift from in-person instruction to being at home in those environments. And when we talk to students, they talked about these kind of major areas in which stress, COVID has impacted their lives. Stress or anxiety up significantly. That disappointment or sadness you saw in the word cloud. Loneliness or isolation. Again, students wanting that kind of connection to other students, but losing that. And then, of course, financial setback is really an issue. So when we ask students, and survey after survey, about 80% said that COVID had negatively impacted their health, and this was sort of in the beginning of the pandemic. Well, as we look at it now, kind of in the latter months of the pandemic, we find 1 year later the same percentage of students are still feeling stressed by COVID. So whether that be the online instruction and not being in person, whether that be the financial challenges or what's happening at home, in general, the COVID crisis has had a negative impact on many, many, many of our students and us too, right? So, all of us who have dealt with this, would probably say that our mental health is not as good as it was today than it might have been before the pandemic. This is interesting in terms of one study that was done by Timely MD about, why are they stressed? The quality of their education, not, adjusting to a new normal, isolation, which we mentioned before, missing the vibrant campus life. I think one of the really interesting takeaways from all this is that what we have underscored is students really enjoy, value, and miss the in-person engagement they find on campus, whether that be walking along the quad, or interacting in the student union or in study groups, or the organized activities that we plan in student affairs. So that, I think, speaks very positively to the impact that we've had and also to the potential going forward. Struggles with remote learning has been well documented, whether it be access to broadband or access to technology, or the fact that maybe in your house you've got dogs and children and families all operating in the same space. Can make the virtual learning very difficult. And how they've coped? Video chats. So obviously that's an important way to do that. A lot of studies, and NSHE did a study also that students were gaming more, talking to their friends on the phone, and then of course, as I did, watching a lot more TV. We also found in our study that students were studying more and spending more time on academics, and not surprisingly for those of you in the 4-year institutions here, students were drinking less and using cannabis less. Fewer opportunities to engage in those behaviors when you were at home. And more recently, the Collegiate Center for Mental Health out of Penn State tried to get a deeper dive into what was happening when students actually did seek help through the counseling center. And during the pandemic and this last year, what they found is that about a third of students who came to the counseling center were coming for COVID-related mental health issues. But 2/3 weren't. 2/3 were coming for some of the, and I wouldn't say normal, but the issues that probably existed prior to the pandemic. With the mental health issues that we have didn't just start in the pandemic, they've been amplified by the pandemic. And what do they come to the counseling center for? Again, mental health, obviously, motivation to focus, again, even that online environment. Loneliness crops up again, their academic performance, missing experiences, missing the liveliness of things. And then I'll come back to this later, but career and employment issues. For anybody who was coming out of college this last year and a half, 2 years, we're facing an inordinately difficult job market, and that was creating some challenges as well. This is one last thing from the Collegiate Center for Mental Health. This looks at 2 different years, 2018, 2019. And you can sort of see where the blue line, which is fall 20, and the red line, which is fall 29, where we saw sort of differences in different mental health issues of students who came to the counseling center. And a lot of these lines are pretty tight, right? If you kind of look at depression is pretty tight, anxiety is pretty tight, so that you don't see a big difference between pre-pandemic and in pandemic. Where you do see the difference is academic distress. You can see I've arrowed that. You see the blue line for fall 20 is somewhat higher. You see a little bit of a bump for eating concerns in this early and late summer, beginning of fall. And we see suicide ideation, family distress on the second to bottom right, increasing as students were home for the summertime and maybe in a little bit more. So on the plus side, I think we might say that, again, the mental health issues that we saw pre-pandemic are still there. and then we haven't seen a dramatic increase in students presenting, although they are reporting being challenged by that. What we do know is that, which is not surprising, is that there's a disproportionate impact on, from an equity standpoint, on depression and anxiety in particular for low-income students, students of color, non-binary students, and LGBTQ students. And this next chart shows that in a little more detail. On the left is depression, on the right is anxiety. This is for undergraduates. And I'll say right now, if you work with a graduate student population, this looks exactly the same. Graduate students also experiencing higher levels of anxiety and depression along these same dimensions. And so what you want to look at here is overall major depressive episode, 35%, general anxiety, 39%. But look at where those numbers are higher for low-income students, for Black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students, non-binary students, transgender students, and all the categories around sexual orientation, LGBTQ students. So, again, our most vulnerable students sometimes, and our most underrepresented students sometimes experiencing higher levels of stress and anxiety. If you look at income, for example, look at the difference between students who identified as wealthy versus students who identify as low income. Those financial issues weighing heavily on anxiety and depression for that subgroup. Okay, let's shift gears now to talking about the impact on student access and success, which gets to be kind of an equity issue that we're dealing with in higher ed right now. I was really struck by this headline in MarketWatch early in the pandemic, which says that higher education already preserved intergenerational, racial, and class inequality, and the pandemic could make it worse, and it has made it worse. What we've seen is significant equity issues where we have drop-offs, as I mentioned earlier, in Latinx enrollment, Black student enrollment, Indigenous student enrollment, low-income students, first-generation students, all impacted by the pandemic. And we're seeing those students coming to college in the fall of 20 and fall of 21 at a lower rate. Here's some maybe digging into why that is. Certainly from an affordability standpoint, no surprise here, but we see that Latinx families more heavily impacted by a change in hours or income due to the coronavirus. Almost 2 out of every 3 Latinx families saying that they were affected in that way. And so, that's going to have a trickle-down effect, because either that affects the affordability of that family to send their son or daughter to college, or it has an impact on their children's need to also seek employment to subsidize the family, which might prevent them from having the time to go to college. Sort of similar data when we sort of like who's lost and who's been laid off. And we see here now more Black families experiencing a layoff, and then Latinx families after that. It's not that white and Asian families weren't affected, but that we see that disproportionate impact. Again, what that means is it may be that we have fewer Black students and fewer Latinx students who are able to enroll given financial considerations. That creates that kind of equity challenge I think we're going to see. And you're going to see that played out in a couple of places. So, what we also know is that these financial issues were significant. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, we see students, struggling with food insecurity, affording rent, laptop, Wi-Fi, all these sort of other expenses, which we know is if you deal with students, particularly one-on-one students, one-on-one with students who are in a lower income SES, we know that sort of these one-time emergency needs are much higher than they are for other sectors, we have high levels of food and housing insecurity, and a lot of technology challenges in the beginning. Well, a year later, what do we look at? Well, it's pretty much the same. A year later, about 60% of students still saying they need help affording food and rent, which reinforces what we know is that it's not always just tuition that is the challenge for students. It's all the things that go around that, which make it more difficult to enroll. Housing, food, books, transportation, all those things. And we see that job loss, food, and rent became some of the 3 reasons students most needed emergency aid this past year. And then the financial impacts. We sort of see these 1 in 5 students are receiving some sort of financial support. Due to around the pandemic, we have job loss, unemployment benefits. Other benefits from the government, and so this is the issue of the day for us: is that the just the wealth gap has increased in our country, and those who are on the lower SES, the lower third in particular, have had a very difficult time marshaling the resources to come to college. And you see that played out in the real data here. And here's data from fall 20 from NCS. And if you sort of look at what we're looking at here, what you see is that overall we lost from 20 versus the previous year about 6.8% drop in enrollment. But look at where the differences are. So if we look at the next line down, students from high poverty schools, the drop off was 11.4% versus 2.9% for low poverty. There we see that equity issue around income. The other distinction of low income schools versus high income schools, again, you see a differential there. And then what they call high minority schools, students who are overrepresented or majority of students of color, Black, Latinx, API, we see a much larger drop-off in enrollment than you see for low minority students. This all speaks to this challenge I think we're facing in higher education, which is what happened to those students? And they didn't come in the fall of 2020. They're probably not coming in the fall of 21. So we have kind of almost a somewhat of a generation of students, many of whom are first generation, low income, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, who did not enroll in college fall 20, fall 21. I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges higher education faces is how do we re-engage those students who are now off cycle? They're now working, they look for jobs, and they're now off the cycle of going into college. Can we get some of those students, those young people back into our collegiate environments? I think that'll be a challenge for us. And we see also, how our sectors were affected by all this. I mentioned earlier, community colleges. So again, on the left here, we see low-income high schools. On the right, high-income high schools. And you can sort of see again, those differences, but it's important to look at from low-income high schools, 18% drop-off from community colleges, which is often, community colleges, as you know, the most affordable option for many low-income families. And so that's part of where we're seeing some of the biggest drop-off. All this brings us to remind ourselves about what equity really means, and I often go back to Sean Harper's quote from the 2019 speech at the NASPA conference, and he was talking about we often talk about completion rates, and he said what we really focus on is completion equity, which in this case for Black students, he says when 6-year graduation rates, this is at 4-year institutions, for Black students match overall 6-year graduation rates, we have completion equity. You could exchange that for Latinx, Indigenous students, some sections of the API community. You could sort of set low income for first generation. As we think about completion equity, we need to think about in those terms. And this is 4-year data, but we do have similar metrics for our 2-year in community colleges as well. Okay, let me just comment a little bit about civic engagement. So we already knew that Generation Z, the generation that's in college today, of the traditional age college students, was more activist than previous generations, and we noted that well before the pandemic hit. And we kind of know that that the activism of today is not the activism of of their grandparents in the 70s. As an aside, the Chronicle of Higher Ed today ran a great story. If you want to look at something that's historical. For me, it was personal because I remember Kent State, but it was it was looking at what happened 50 years later to the woman in the picture who had her hands up and was standing over the dead body of one of the students who was shot in Kent State. It was really one of those iconic pictures from the 70s. I'm sure you've seen it. But they tracked this woman and what has happened to her life after that, and the photographer who took that picture. Really gripping story. Well, today we have Black Lives Matter. The ongoing assault on Black and brown bodies in this country, and some of the violence often around law enforcement that's generated a lot of protests and activism. And so I think it's interesting to think about what are we looking for, like coming out of the summer and this last year on our campuses. Well, let's look at a couple things. One is that we already know from the UCLA data, freshman data, that we have more students on the far right and conservative, and more students on the liberal and far left than we have middle of the road. And that number of middle of the road is the smallest it's been in 30 years, which mimics what we see in our country, right? We have much wider ranges of political views. And I think that this sort of speaks to this need that we're going to continue to have on our campus of how we create spaces for the folks who are on the left side of the political spectrum and the right side of the spectrum to talk and communicate with each other. We also know from the same survey that 38%, a pretty high percentage, anticipate or at least some chance they will participate in student protests or demonstrations. I think as activism increased nationally, I think students expect to do that on campus, and freshmen do in particular. So I think we're going to see a very different political climate and climate around protests on our campuses this fall than we saw last year when we were more de-densified. And then you see this in another study looks at people, how they participate. They either have done this or might do it in the future. And these are younger demographic, 18 to 29. If you kind of go down, attend a march or demonstration, 29% have done it, but 31% might do it in the future. So if you add that up, that's 60% right there. Almost 2/3 of folks either have or will participate in some kind of protest on campus. So that's something for us to think about as well. And then lastly, this really struck me. This was some data around controversial topics: politics, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, and how we break down in this sort of odd progressive conservative breakdown in Democrats and Republicans. And if you look at, just take race, for example, 36% of Republicans are reluctant to discuss race. Only 18% of Democrats. That is, really challenging as we're trying to kind of have these dialogues in our campus that we have folks who are on the right or Republican having a more difficult time talking about some of these controversial topics. And we also see this around race as well. So we have 30% of whites who are reluctant to share their views around race, and 27% of API identified folks. So this notion of moving people to the civic space, I think, is increasingly important. And this last data point tells you why is that. It's not because faculty, professors are critiquing them. It's because their own peers are they're challenged in front of their own peers. And so creating spaces where there's grace and courage to allow these kind of dialogues to happen, I think it's going to be a really important challenge for us in this highly polarized world in which we live. So I want to close on the employment market. If this looks like the 2008-2009 market, we're going to have a generation that's going to come out of college with a much more challenging job market. 20% of students saying that their COVID made their career exploration much worse, and something for us to pay attention to. Now, the most recent NSHE data, sort of if you look at the fall 21 on the bottom and the spring, we can do see that more employers are increasing hiring and fewer employers are decreasing hiring. So I think that overall is probably positive. We're seeing some improvement in the job market as we come out of the economic crisis. So it may not be as bleak as it was in the last job market. No matter what, though, we know that things that matter are practical experience. And we see over and over again, this is a survey of employers, that an internship with their organization or in their industry is the highest rated factor for how they would look at a candidate. Major is next, but then look at other work experience, including on-campus employment, extracurricular activities, leadership. So I think one of the things we can do is continue to ensure that students have access to internships, access to on-campus employment, and the kinds of engagement opportunities that we historically have done will help these students in their job search. We got a lot of work to do to ensure that internships are protected. They were massively affected last summer. That's something that we certainly can focus on. And lastly, from the career standpoint, for my career center folks who work in this area, this is, I think, a powerful thing that we should consider, every one of us should consider on our campuses. And this is two dimensions. One is, do you think college is worth the cost? And how well did your college or university connect what students were learning and and how that connects to a meaningful career? And you can see it's completely linear. The higher the extent to which students felt like the campus had done a good job in connecting what they were learning to a career, the more likely they were to think that the college is worth the cost. When they don't think the campus did that as good a job with that, they don't think it was worth the cost. So that's sort of I think a reminder to all of us about how important the career process is, not just the career office, but the entire holistic career process from freshman year in orientation all the way to job placement. So a couple of final thoughts, and we'll take some questions. One, expect the competition for resources will become more intense on campus across all divisions. And so demonstrating value for departments and divisions is going to be even more important. As I mentioned before, career development, workforce development, development of 21st century skills is going to be a top 5 institutional priority and a distinguishing factor that we're going to see more and more between institutions as they try to distinguish themselves in the marketplace. We became more digital in student service and student affairs over the past year, and we need to continue to do that. Whether that be the increasing hybridization of higher education, serving adult learners, serving online learners, that we can continue the work we've been doing in student affairs to become more digital. College affordability is the equity issue of the day. We are going to have to address that. And I think one of the things I would say that's going to be necessary is that institutions, particularly 4 institutions, will have to divert money away from merit-based aid and more to need-based aid, which sort of gets out of the college ranking kind of business a little bit more. But we're going to have to address some of these affordable issues going forward. It's why we're so high on doubling the Pell Grant as a public policy agenda item with the Biden administration, because we think that also can have a positive impact, in addition to some of the free college programs that are being suggested, where families under 100 or 125,000 would have free access to education. I really think that we have got to be at the center of this whole challenge to our democracy, engaging students in conversations about racial justice and equity, and creating those opportunities on campus. A college president in the Midwest really said, in looking at the dysfunction of our Congress, really suggested that the seeds we plant in colleges and universities among our students are the ones that kind of will grow over the years to perhaps challenge some of the impractical and inefficient ways that our governments work. And then again, from this equity lens, we have a lot of sort of smaller efforts personal efforts to support student success. We're going to have to bring those to scale in a much more effective way than we have before the pandemic. So let me finish with one last quote, and then we'll take some questions. One of the other movies that's been on HBO has been Castaway, which I love. I love that movie, and I love Tom Hanks' portrayal of this person who's struggling to stay alive on this deserted island. Chuck Nolan was the character, but eventually, as you know in the story, if you've seen the movie, he comes home and he's back home and he's trying to adjust to this life not on this island. And then he's talking to his friend and he says, "I know what I have to do now. I've got to keep breathing because tomorrow the sun will rise, and who knows what the tide could bring." That's my overall sense of where we are in higher ed and also in student affairs. I'm very bullish on where we're heading. I think higher education will continue to play an even more important role going forward, and I think student affairs will as well. You could even argue that student affairs is probably more central and more vital today than it has ever been, and I think that gives us a really positive view of our future. So thanks. I hope I've shared some things that have been engaging for you and give you a little bit of a sense of where we're heading. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to you live. So Barbara, I want to leave it up to you to sort of manage anybody who might have a question, and maybe you can repeat it to me, and I'm happy to talk about anything I talked about or things I didn't talk about. I talk about Susie Orman's speech at the NASPA conference. Happy to do that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Kruger. If you do have a question for Dr. Kruger, please place that in the chat. We do have some that have come in, and we will try to get to as many as we can as time permits. So the first question is, what is some advice for student affairs professionals who are struggling with mental health themselves while supporting students in crisis? Yeah. So that is a real issue. And then, I think I have, I spend some time looking at the Student Affairs Facebook page. And I certainly have seen exhaustion, and stress, anxiety, depression, feeling overwhelmed as sort of symptoms of what staff and faculty are feeling as well. And so this is sort of physician heal thyself. You have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. And so what does that mean? What that means is seek mental health support if you need it. Your campus through this EAP program or whatever might be available.
do the same things we know work in other cases that are sort of not heavily clinical, which is talk about it with your friends and colleagues. Make sure you have spaces to do that. You have to turn off the devices and the email and the demands, as difficult as that might be. I think one of the things that we've learned in the remote world is that some of the natural barriers we had when we were on campus have dissolved, as we now are 24/7 sitting on our Zoom calls. And it's very easy to allow your day to go from 7.5 to 8 to 9 to 10 to 12 hours in trying to meet the demands. Talk to your supervisor about creating reasonable limits around that. Take time off. I can't tell you how many student affairs staff I talk to who have accumulated all this leave because they don't feel like they can take off. You've got to take some of that time off. So I think, again, you have to take care of yourself first before you can take care of others. Obviously, if you are really experiencing challenges around anxiety, depression, even suicide ideation, please, support each other, seek professional help, and then try to engage in some of that kind of those other kind of behaviors. Again, also think about what we're asking our students to do. We provide counseling services. We can provide telecounseling services, but a lot of the efforts we've been engaged in over the last 3 or 4 years, and even more important in the pandemic, is how do we build the resiliency and the capacity to get through some of the stress, which means focusing on sleep and nutrition and exercise as part of our routine, so that we can also have the capacity to manage some of the stress that we're dealing with. And then give yourself some grace, I would just say, in general. And this has been an extraordinarily difficult time. No one was expected to have to kind of rise above all this. We've all experienced some of the challenges around that. I know at the end of one story that my wife, who lives upstairs, because I live down here in my office, when I come up at the end of the day, through the pandemic, she says, "I've never seen you so exhausted." And I know, we all have felt that. And I think, so acknowledging that, identifying it is really important.
Thank you. What core themes or issues does NASPA plan on focusing on post-pandemic to support higher education professionals?
Yeah. Well, we've got a couple of things I'll tell you one that is high of mind for me. And that is, if you talk to young professionals, there is a lot of frustration about the expectations of work in our field and the pay that goes with it. There was a thread just today I read in the Student Affairs Facebook page about this very issue. Someone posted something about they have a master's degree and they're making $38,000. That doesn't seem commensurate with their education. And there was 221 comments that followed that post, and a lot of them were sort of supporting that. I think from a NASPA standpoint, when your workforce, and all of you are a workforce, and particularly the young and mid-level professionals, when your workforce becomes dissatisfied with the work, we have to wake up and pay attention a little bit. And that might mean recalibrating salaries, workloads. This is very difficult when we've had to make so many cuts, of course, and this is not an easy fix. But I think we're going to have to address this, because what we're seeing is, at least anecdotally, more student affairs folks leaving the field, more going into student affairs adjacent fields, or just leaving altogether out of dissatisfaction. So it's something that no profession can really sustain talent loss in great numbers if that's what we're experiencing. So that's one area. Second is that I think that I'm challenging my staff in the work that we're doing to truly be an equity-minded association, and living that on a daily basis. And I think that theme around equity, around racial justice, and identifying areas of white privilege and unconscious bias, and how our practices can challenge some of those historic structures that we have, both in higher education as well as in our profession, are really important. Those are themes that I think are critical for us going forward. And I would just say, lastly, I think that addressing some of these equity attainment issues within our college campuses is really going to be critical. I think that we will see, and we are seeing, a shift in student affairs from from sort of the way in which you used to do the work to more of a orientation towards student success, in particular with an equity lens. And so I think focusing on that is important. We have some initiatives that are focused on an area. We have a Center for First Generation Student Success, which is focusing on first generation students, which is a highly intersectional population, overrepresented with low income and students of color. Also, we're working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on our improving advising across the higher ed with an equity lens on that as well. So those are a few things that jump out. We have also this summer we're doing 2 research projects. One is on campuses who have issued statements around racial justice issues and how we bring those to action so that we're not just talking, we're actually doing. And we also have a campus police and policing research project going on. We're looking at both staff and faculty and student views around campus police and what reform needs to look like at the campus level, knowing that that's taking place at the city level and municipal level as well.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. Do you think that virtual engagement, both inside and outside of the classroom, should continue post-pandemic? And what resources does NASPA plan on providing higher education professionals in this area?
Great. Yes. I am super excited and also energized really by the creativity and the innovation the student affairs employed during the pandemic to engage with their students. Some of it's sort of like, an online Zumba class, nutrition classes, you see how your recreation staff kind of really pivoted to creating online opportunities. Some of it's around how we did more virtual coaching and mentoring. Just a variety of things that we did. Some of it was place-based, right? So some of it was not just online, but some of it was how we reuse spaces on campus. But I think all of that is important. I think it's important for 2 reasons. One is we are definitely going to see the hybridization of higher education continue. So as we do that, we're going to have to, if we don't engage students virtually, we're going to miss them. 2, students actually like some of this. They miss the in-person stuff, but it's not an either or. I think it can be an and. 3, I think we have to acknowledge that some of our place-based engagement opportunities miss adult learners, non-traditional students, perhaps who have kids at home, non-traditional students who may be working full-time. So if we are truly trying to serve the student body, just like many the community college professionals here already know this, I think we need to think more broadly about what student services and how to do that. One resource I'll share with you, we were very blessed to get a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation right in the middle of the pandemic to identify exemplars, campuses who have done really extraordinary things in online student services. And we created these, they were called Innovation Awards. We were able to give out $50,000 awards to campuses. We gave out 10 awards, some of them for 50, some of them 15,000. They're all listed on our website on the Innovation Award page. Just Google NASPA Innovation Awards. And you can see 10 examples of really creative ways that campuses have pivoted to using online student services. Some of them are 4-year, some of them are 2-year. And I think it's a really wide range of institutions. And so that's a great resource. And then we're going to also load up, I don't think it's there yet, but we'll be loading up all the entrants, because a campus may not have won an award, but they still had a great idea. So that is certainly one example. And for a more broader example, resource, if you Google NASPA Inside Track, we published a paper before the pandemic, actually, about the emergence of online student services as a imperative in our field. So you might Google that as well, and as a resource. So it's also on our website. So I would say that as a field, we have been behind in online student services and engagement opportunities. The pandemic accelerated that, and I'm hoping that we can continue to advance that work going forward. So. Well, Barbara, I know we're out of time. Thank you for the good questions. I hope this spurred some thinking and maybe some conversations at your staff meetings and some of your opportunities to engage with each other in the future. And I look forward to seeing many of you either in Nevada or at a future NASPA conference. But thanks for having me. Shannon, thanks again for the invitation.
And thank you so much, Dr. Kruger, for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming. So I would like to invite Vice President Rivera back to the screen to offer a few closing remarks.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's summit. I know I have. Moderators and speakers, you did an excellent job. I hope all of you leave today with either new knowledge gained or knowledge shared. But don't stop there. Bring those ideas you learned today back to your college or university and continue to share with others at your institution, including your leadership. At the end of the day, we are all here to promote student learning and development, providing those student services that support students to realize their educational goals. The Student Affairs Council, or SAC, is a group that comprises all the Chief Student Affairs Officers at all NSHE institutions. We meet monthly to discuss and provide information, opinions, and advice to NSHE leadership to facilitate decision-making in student affairs. SAC will continue to promote the type of exchange of ideas you were able to participate in today. Finally, I want to leave you with a quote from American author and disability activist Helen Keller, who once said, "Alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much." Thank you.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you everyone for attending the NSHE Student Affairs Summit today. I do want to send some thank yous out to the members of our planning committee at this time. So from the College of Southern Nevada, Felicia Thomas, Great Basin College, Jennifer Brown, Nevada State College, Phil Lamont and Carlos Navarro, Truckee Meadows Community College, Natalie Brown and Yvonne Allen, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Stephanie Cooper, Savannah Baltera, Kirsten Dimmick and Adam Crisp, and University of Nevada, Reno, Jim Fitzsimmons and Mary Ann Christensen. Western Nevada College, Heather Ricallo. So thank you so much for joining us today. I would also like to thank one more time Vice President Rivera, Chancellor Rose, and Dr. Kevin Kruger for joining us today. There also was a survey sent out yesterday to all attendees via email. You can also find it on the event page under the survey tab. We do just ask for you to take a moment and take that survey to give some feedback on how we did today. So again, thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.